Unexpected item in bagging area. A 10-minute short story from the Tales of the Sacred Sword. Deeb dropped the copper coins into the Kygon farmer's palm. This was the only place he could buy produce on Sevens Day. Anyone with Orlurian blood, such as himself, would be at church and would not be open for business. Deeb had skipped service that day because he didn't want to wait until Wednesday to buy his produce. He nodded goodbye, then slung the sack of potatoes over his shoulder. They weighed as much as a schoolchild. With his free hand, he hoisted the bag of turnips. At least the turnip bag had a handle that was tied by strings at both ends. Deeb wrapped the strings around his hand until the bag was high enough to clear the ground as he walked. The turnips and potatoes felt like carrying 2 dogs. The bags were bulky and heavy. They had to be enough to last him through the winter. The long walk back to and through town would be a good workout. Not that Deeb needed it. After working from sun up to sundown, digging ditches along the road for the last 4 days, fatigue and strain set in along Deeb's upper back, shoulders, arms and wrists as he walked along the lonely country road. His breath was long and heavy. He took the journey step by step. The turnips spilled out from the bottom of the bag and rolled all over the empty road. Deeb set down his sack of potatoes, then raised his turnip bag. It was ripped clean along the bottom. Garbage. He sighed. He was halfway home, a solid hour's walk to either his place or returning to the farmer. Besides, chances were good if he left these turnips on the road, someone was likely to steal them. Deeb knew a thing or two about stealing himself. He looked up and down the road. No one was in sight. After several minutes of frustration and deliberation, he decided to hide the turnips in the ditch and come back later with a sack. It would be a long day, but Deeb was used to long days. Deeb slid down into the ditch, a ditch he had dug last summer, and began collecting the turnips. He piled them into a spot that was easy to remember, but difficult to spot by passers-by. Not that this road had many travelers on Sevens Day. Most God-fearing people were at service. Something caught his eye. Deeb stood and walked a dozen paces. The little black lump at first looked like a dead animal, then a rock. Then Deeb recognized it for what it was, a velvet bag, as dark as the heart of Mendax. It was only half the size he needed to carry the turnips, but it was better than nothing. Pyrrhus had smiled upon him today, and he hadn't even gone to holy service. He always thought holy service was a waste of time. Holding the bag open with one hand, he tossed in the turnips one at a time. Eventually, he looked around and no turnips remained on the ground. The black bag didn't look large enough to hold all the turnips, but it was. He stood and lifted the bag. It weighed nothing. Deeb panicked that his turnips had vanished. He looked inside the bag and saw nothing but darkness. Thinking of a turnip, he reached inside and grasped. He pulled his hand out and marveled at the turnip. The lone turnip was heavier than the velvet bag. He tossed it back in the bag, but the bag's weight did not increase. An idea struck Deeb. He ripped open the potato sack and began pouring the potatoes into the velvet bag. They went in with ease. The bag weighed nothing, and when he peered inside, none of its contents could be seen. He reached inside and thought of a potato. When he pulled his hand out, it held a potato. He reached in again and thought of a turnip. When he pulled his hand out, it held a turnip. Deeb smiled and tossed both the turnip and the potato back in the black velvet bag. What a day to skip Sevens Day service, He was never going to church again. Deeb walked back to town with a smile and a lightheartedness in his step. Without the extra weight, he made it back to town 20 minutes faster than he expected. He strolled through the market. Few stores were open on Sevens Day, only those run by Kaigons. Only a few people trickled along its shops. Most vendors' shops were closed and locked. A Kaigon man browsed the wares of another Kaigon man's stall. He held aloft a ruby, and the two haggled in their foreign language. Deeb approached the stall. Jewels of every shade, cut, and color twinkled and sparkled. They mesmerized Deeb. At the shop's periphery, a diamond like none other. It was as large as an acorn and shined like the midday sun. A glass case the size of a man's head contained it. The other customer held a ruby overhead to view it through the sunlight. Without thinking, Deeb snatched the case containing the diamond. The bottom of the case was covered in iron, and Deeb could barely lift it with one arm. He shoved it in the black velvet bag. A chain connected the case to the merchant's stall. It rattled, but when the case went into the bag, it severed the chain. Once the case disappeared, it weighed nothing and was no longer visible, just like everything else in the bag. Deeb left before the merchant could notice the missing diamond. He took random directions along town, always twisting and turning. If the merchant had followed him, Deeb would have lost him by now. Deeb was lost as well. He stood alone in the alleyway. He had never been here before. Deeb thought of the diamond, and he reached in the bag. He pulled it out and marveled in its glory. He shoved it back in the bag and looked over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching. He tested the bag again by pulling out a potato, then a turnip. Deeb's luck had finally turned around. He vowed never to go to Sevens Day service again. But where did the items go when he put them in the bag? Deeb held the black velvet bag close to his face. He could see nothing. He stuck his head in to get a better look. Then, Deeb disappeared into the bag. It dropped to the ground, weightless and empty in appearance, forever to hold its weightless and invisible contents. Contents like turnips, potatoes, diamonds, and men who skip Sevens Day service.